Hey, welcome to Faith and Politics, a show dedicated to discussing issues surrounding the intersection of church, state, and politics, and the examination of whether you're allowing your faith to shape your politics, or are your politics starting to shape your faith? In other words, what do you do when God and government come face to face? I'm your host, Orlin Johnson. Let me introduce you to our four panelists for today. First, we have with us Mr. Andre Wong, General Counsel of the North Pacific Union Conference of the Seventh-day Adventist Church. We have with us also Mr. Violates, who's with the Indiana Conference Public Affairs and Religious Liberty Department, and it's their director. We have Mr. Rashern Baker, who's the president and CEO of the Baker Strategy Group and University of Maryland professor of public policy. And we have with us Ms. Bettina Krause, who's the editor of Liberty Magazine. Great to have you here with us. Looking forward to our conversation for today. You know, it seems like a lot of local legislatures are starting to believe the concept that religion and politics are interrelated and cannot be separated. In one of the most recent legislative sessions that began in North Dakota, lawmakers have introduced House Bill 1145, which would make posting the Ten Commandments mandatory in all public schools and higher education classrooms. We have a senator by the name of Castaneda, who is a proponent, said that we have to put this in school because it will instill certain values in our children. One of the other writers of the bill decided to think that the concept of official religion may be established, but guess what? We don't think that's a big deal. You know, Viola, we're looking at a lot of institutions and states that believe that the moral values of the Ten Commandments is something that should be applied in all walks of life. But what we're seeing more and more is that they want to see it applied in schools at the elementary level and above. I'm a religious guy and I believe in the Ten Commandments, but is this going too far? We're now seeing it in Louisiana. We now see it in North Dakota. Where are we going with this? Or should somebody come in and try to stamp this out and put it all down?
I agree with you. I personally believe in the Ten Commandments. By the grace of God, believe in following them. But, you know, my concern is that the public schools need to be a safe place for all children, regardless of their religious background or lack thereof. And so, you know, the Supreme Court has generally been very protective of children, at least from high school down, in terms of their cases. And so we have an 1980 case out of Kentucky, where the Supreme Court ruled that the statute requiring the Ten Commandment posting violated the Establishment Clause. And so the problem is not the lack of Ten Commandments in the classroom. The problem is the lack of Ten Commandments, prayer, and Bible reading in the homes of our land, because the classroom can only deal with what's given it.
When I take a look at that concept, Rashern, it looks as though the idea of where we're going with this, there is nowhere to stop, because the idea is, well, if I got the Ten Commandments in there, should I have a Bible in there? Should I have the Quran in there? Should we have the Torah in there? I mean, that seems to be the question. What is public school and what is private school? And it looks like you can't even tell the difference anymore.
Well, you know, Orlin, we talked about separation of church and state on this program a number of times. And this is where we're starting to see a turn back toward a nationalized religion. Most of the United States is Christian, and you're starting to see people, especially now, exercise that power, where the Ten Commandments in South Dakota or North Dakota, or what you see in Alabama, we're going toward that, where it's making it unfriendly for those who have other faiths. I'm waiting for the case where we see someone actually post something from the Torah or the Quran and see the reaction of politicians throughout. Because it's also, just real quickly, it's also a divide as to where you are, whether you're in a red state or a blue state, as to how this affects you. And I think that's the issue where we've got to get a grip to, or else we're going to start seeing this come apart.
You know, Orlin, I interviewed a pastor down south last year when Texas was trying to get a similar law passed. And he told me about an experiment he did on his congregation. He said one Sunday morning, who here thinks that the schools should display the Ten Commandments in the classrooms? There's sort of this loud, sustained applause. And he said, who now is ready to come up here and recite the Ten Commandments in order? And he was the only one left clapping. And I think right there, that's the issue. I mean, and that reveals that what we're dealing with here is not a desire to cause sort of moral improvement in our young people. It's really a desire to politicize faith.
Mm.
And that is the result of all of these pieces of legislation. It's a movement, a trend that is being spurred on by recent changes in Supreme Court jurisprudence, their reliance on history and tradition and practices rather than older, more stringent Establishment Clause tests. Mm-hmm. And it has invited these folk who want to politicize religion, it has invited them to come forward to pass these laws, to defend these laws in the courts and see how far they can push the Supreme Court to constitutionally validate what they're doing.
You know, Andre, what I'm troubled with when I think about this, America is a country that was based on the idea that you get to come here and serve your God the way you see fit. No matter what your religious beliefs may be, this gives the impression that the dominant religion is really now trying to impose its will on everyone. And to me, that seems to be where the rubber is hitting the road. But then some people will say, well, if that's my community, that should be what I should be allowed to do. What's wrong with that?
Right. And it seems that it'll happen in very benign and subtle ways. And, you know, I'll take, you know, I'll play devil's advocate or perhaps God's advocate in this case, in favor of displaying the Ten Commandments, that there is nothing intrinsically theocratic about the Ten Commandments. They argued that prohibiting murder and theft and destruction of others' property are not religious principles, but just rules of good living, and that the mere display is passive. So it does not do anything to people. And in fact, they argue that the real injury of the Establishment Clause protects not being exposed to religious messages. But here's the problem: the endorsement of a particular religion. So really, what this comes down to is the religious coercion, as a court put it, in the schools, and and as we've seen this in Louisiana and Alabama and Texas and Oklahoma and now North Dakota. So in the words of Ronald Reagan, there you go again.
And the trouble with all of this is that the benign aspect of it kind of creeps in slowly. It's just great principles. This is something we should instill in our children. But I guess the real question, Bettina, I'm trying to get to is, how do we balance this? Let's say that this is becoming the law of the land. Do we now see an instance where we may have to figure out how to have the Ten Commandments in one corner, the Torah in another corner, the Muslim document someplace else, and a place where you can sit down and pray towards the east? I mean, once you open the door, where does it stop?
And this is where the rubber meets the road, Orlin, because this is the reality that people are just not getting, that they may be really comfortable with these laws when these laws support their preferred faith. But when they understand that our religious freedom regime means that there has to be government neutrality between religions, then when we see these other expressions being introduced into classrooms, for instance, there's going to be concern. And I think this will reveal, I guess, the underlying premise of these laws. And the underlying premise is that this country is a Christian nation. That is the premise that is driving these laws. There were a recent rash of laws mandating posters saying, "In God we trust," in classrooms. You may remember that from a year or so back. There was an organization that specialized in donating to classrooms because classrooms had to hang it if it was donated. "In God we trust," with the LGBTQ rainbow behind it, and with a Torah message or a message from the Quran, and I think these sort of tensions reveal what is motivating these laws, and I think it forces us to look into the reality mirror and say, hey, we are not a Christian nation constitutionally. We may be sociologically. We're not constitutionally. We need to put a stop to this.
Sharon, one thing I find interesting is the idea that I find it more and more difficult to determine, is politics and religion interrelated, especially in certain parts of our country? I live in a jurisdiction that has 900 churches within a 500 square mile, and no one could ever run for office and be the chief executive in that region without spending probably every Sunday during the campaign trail and every Saturday during the campaign trail in and out of churches. So to me, if that's what is required for you to become elected, it seems as though the idea that there's this disconnect between politics and religion is a fallacy that we all will chuckle about behind the scenes.
As someone who's done that for the last 30 years in the very jurisdiction where you live, you're absolutely right. I've spent Sundays and Saturdays in churches throughout. I think the difference is, and this is where we have to be careful, is that, and I said this to my son when he thought about running for office, I said, you want to understand what people culturally and their faith. So you want to go to those places of religion so that you understand what you're protecting. And I think that's the part we have to remember, is that we're not opposed to religion. We want people to be able to worship, throughout this country in their own way. And so we need to understand that. But we also don't want to feel like we're imposing our faith on them in public spaces, whether it be the courts, whether it be, our schools, especially where there's a captive audience. And so I think that's where we have to be very, very careful. And it's something that I was mindful as an elected official.
And, Justice O'Connor famously said in her McCreary concurrence, why would we trade a system that has served us so well for one that has served others so poorly?
And, Vilo, one of the things as you raised that point, when Christians sometimes see somebody wants to put the 10 Commandments somewhere, their view is, I'm not offended by that. I kind of believe in that document. But it seems to me that should be the group that probably should be even more vocal. Because the moment you start pressing and allowing your own personal beliefs to allow you to be quiet, well, what happens when something else shows up that you're not comfortable with, and then now you want the government to come in and cut it down? So it seems to me that that's where the real rub is, that the majority loves it when it works for them, but the majority probably is not going to be happy when it doesn't.
That's exactly right. And we need to be more respectful. It's about respect. If we want respect as Christians, we need to respect others who believe otherwise.
And I'm going to let that be the last word, because I think where we're going with all of this is the idea of being respectful for all religious groups. The best way to do that is not to highlight any one religious group in any particular way. And that's what this country is really all about. There's been a case that's out there that's really starting to get a lot of people talking, and it's called Catholic Charities versus Whitmer. One of the things in our society that we're seeing is that in recent years, there's an explosion in the number of children that are identifying as transgender. And many of these children have been led down a path of thinking, well, maybe I should go through gender transition or drugs or hormones or surgeries, which sometimes can even result in permanent health issues. And what we're seeing is that we're got a large number of states, over 25. And even in the European Union, we have a lot of countries that have banned or strictly limited gender transitions for children who are advocating more for a different way of life. The idea of maybe being just simply more compassionate. But there's a law in Michigan right now that bans the approach that says that you can be compassionate or have a conversation other than moving forward with what a child may want to do. And what we have is a situation where a woman by the name of Emily was deciding that I was contacted with these children who had these thoughts, and I wanted to not rush into it. but to allow them to understand there may be other ways to deal with this. But this particular case, Michigan is saying you don't get to do that. You got to go this route. There's no other route. You know, Andre, when you see something like that in a state like Michigan, which is also one of those states that sometimes it goes blue, sometimes it goes red. I wouldn't say that it's leaning in any one direction, but this seems to be a very, very clear point of direction that they want to go in, and now they find themselves in court.
Right, and it's illustrative of the politicization of this very issue of the LGBTQ question of how do we as a nation or even as a society kind of deal with this emerging issue with youth, and a particular ban on these therapeutic methods, in my opinion, violates constitutional protections of free speech, free exercise of religion, and parental rights. This is an overreach into the freedom of conscience of therapists and counselors, and an overreach into their professional practices, their modes and methods of how they treat their patients. So, you know, as an attorney, I can't imagine the government dictating how I practice law, how I formulate an argument, or how I deal with clients. So whether it's an attorney or a therapist or a mental health counselor, the freedom of conscience is how they practice their craft and should be protected.
You know, and I agree with how Andre has laid this case out. And I think that in talking about this case, I think we need to start with an acknowledgement. And that acknowledgement is that these are real families, these are real kids, and they are suffering a lot of heartbreak and anguish, and that the discussion around this issue has unfortunately been more about ideologically being absolutist than it is about caring for vulnerable and hurting kids. And I think that's what we are seeing in the way this law has been framed. It lacks nuance. It lacks the ability to allow professionals to take into account scientific data and scientific ideas. And you know, this is an area of law, area of medical practice. Let's not forget this. This is an area that's relatively new. It's relatively unstudied. It's not like treating a broken leg where there's a consensus on how that should be done. And I think the laws around this really difficult, challenging topic need to reflect the fact that this area of medical practice is in flux. And most of all, we need to remember that these are real kids and these are real families, and we need to approach these issues in a way that is not politically and ideologically driven.
The adolescent years are tumultuous years, you know, as the hormones start flowing, and you know, kids can be all over the spectrum. And you know, I think we need to walk slowly, you know, through this time, and not rush to judgment, and not make decisions that irrevocably change our lives. I read about a young lady, an attractive young lady, who decided that she wanted to be a man, had double mastectomy, and then realized she had made a horrific mistake. And she gone back to being a young lady, and is hoping that the therapy she took does not render her infertile. So, you know, we need to not rush through this process, and most of all, we need to give therapists the freedom to exercise their craft, and instead of stiff-arming them. That's really concerning to me.
You know, Sharon, we have turned into a country of it's all about your therapist. And, you know, and the idea now that this is a situation where it says, no counseling, no therapy, nothing along those lines. We're going down this road, don't go anyplace else. And we have religious institutions now, like, for example, Catholic Charities and other institutions that are of a similar nature, that it's contrary to their beliefs, and they're trying to figure out, how do we operate, especially when you've been doing good work? And that seems to be the struggle here.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right, Orland. I think the problem we see now is that we've made it more political. As Bettina said earlier, we've made this about politics and not about the body of work that has been done in the medical field and in the therapy field. I mean, we got here through this whole process that actually young people were killing themselves based on what they were going through and not, being able to talk or be who they were called to be. I think we have to put this in the hands. It's very delicate. It is not political. It's not, red state versus blue state. This is something that people, as the panelists have said, have struggled with, young people. And so we need to have this where it belongs, that is in the medical field, and doing what's in the best interest of the children so that they grow up to be, adults. In many cases, we see that this has had, bad side effects over the years, and that's why the body of medicine has evolved. And so what I hope is that, the politics get out of this and let the medicine and those who know what they're doing take front and center.
Can I just interject a caveat here? Because there is a history, I guess, of so-called conversion therapy, which seeks to very coercively realign individuals' gender identity, in the area of minors. It's coercive, and it is, I think, generally understood as being bad professional practice. That's not what we're talking about here. What we're talking about here is client-led therapy,
right,
where a therapist is seeking to engage with these issues in a way that aligns with the client's own articulated faith and values, not in a coercive way. And I think it's really important to make that distinction. But the law in this case is ruling out not only the more abusive practices, but also the potentially helpful practices that are at issue here.
Andre, we're going to end up in the Sixth Circuit on this. So when we think about that particular court as it relates to the other circuits, where do we see this kind of leaning potentially when we get up to the next level here?
Yeah, and that's, I think that Rashawn hit a very, very valid point about this being a medical question. And I completely agree that, this needs to be taken out of the political sphere, and maybe even the jurisprudential sphere. And there are medical bodies, there are peer committees, there are regulatory bodies in the medical field that have the perspective and expertise and experience to really look and examine and deal with this very, very question. Those are the people that really should be examining this on a peer and scientific level, not at a political level in a legislature or courts for that matter.
But Vilo, how do you take the politics out of politics? I mean, you have a legislature here that is trying to respond to some degree based on a community that they live in. And we say, well, we'd love politics to be taken out of it. But at the end of the day, politicians are doing things that they think are going to be in their best interest in the long run. How do we separate that?
Well, of course, they want to be voted back into office. And I think they're catering to probably a small portion of their constituency. And it's certainly, and often it can be a very vocal constituency. But, medicine has to rule. The rules of medicine have to guide. There was a case out of Florida where Florida wanted to restrict practice. And the courts overturned that. We had that issue trying to arise here in Indiana, and what a pastor could say. And they ended up dropping it over in West Lafayette, where Purdue University is. So, we need to do what's in the best interest of the child. What does the medical evidence show? And that's what should control.
Sharon, you're probably one of the three individuals that I spent a lot of conversations with who actually worked in a state legislature and represented a district. And sometimes you represent even a small district. But I always thought that the idea in those bodies were making decisions that were in the best interest of the state, as opposed to just simply the best interest of your own smaller or larger particular jurisdiction. Or do I have something wrong here?
No, you're absolutely right. And that's where the conflict comes in a lot of times, as you have your individual districts. When I was in the state legislature, that may lean very, very, Christian and religious in my case, but you have the state as a whole, which is diverse and complex. Your job, and it's explained to you, is to represent the entire state and to make sure everyone can practice freely. I think what we start to see in the politics of issues like this is that what's popular in the nation, where you see people are getting elected and saying things and it gets you votes, that's where people start to gravitate toward and forget their real mission, which is to make sure that people can have fuller and more quality of life, and they can practice their faith and their medicine, in a way that's beneficial to everyone. And I think that's where we start to lose some of our religion, quite honestly, as elected officials.
Well, it seems to me that where we're really going with a lot of this is we almost have to go back and start training politicians as to what their real jobs are. When your primary objective is say and do whatever's necessary so I can get reelected again, your ministry and your mission are going to be very, very different. But if your ministry and your mission as a politician is going to keep you focused on doing what's either in the best interest of the child or the best interest of your jurisdiction, in conjunction with the best interests of the state that you represent, then we will probably start seeing those type of things where actually religion and politics can intertwine peacefully. Hey, Andre, tell me something I don't know.
According to Jewish tradition, all 613 laws enshrined in the Torah are really just summarized in the 10 Commandments, showing that Christians aren't the only ones that over-codify God's word.
Rashawn, tell me something I don't know.
Well, the first African-American president of Howard University happened to be a Baptist minister to make sure that those 10 Commandments were enshrined in the students. And he's one of the longest serving, Mordecai Wyatt Johnson.
Bettina, tell me something I don't know.
Okay, now for something completely random. Did you know that Charles Darwin, the Darwin of evolution fame, was believed to be the first person to actually put wheels on a chair and thus create the modern desk office chair?
Charles. Vilo, tell me something I don't know.
Going back to history, Robert E. Lee signed his amnesty oath on October 2, 1865, so that he might be pardoned and citizenship restored. However, his oath was lost and not rediscovered until 1970 in the National Archives. In 1975, President Ford signed a joint congressional resolution posthumously restoring his full rights of citizenship.
A little late, but beautiful to hear. Great conversation, guys. Looking forward to doing it again. And thanks again for you being here with us. Hope you enjoyed our conversation. Just remember, if it's about God and government, it's faith and politics. See you next time.